Book 1, Chapter 13, of Resurrection. After that, Nekhludoff did not see Katusha for more than 3 years. When he saw her again, he had just been promoted to the rank of officer, and was going to join his regiment. On the way, he came to spend a few days with his aunts, being now a very different young man from the one who'd spent the summer with them 3 years before. He then had been an honest, unselfish lad, ready to sacrifice himself for any good cause. Now he was depraved and selfish, and thought only of his own enjoyment. Then God's world seemed a mystery which he tried enthusiastically and joyfully to solve. Now everything in life seemed clear and simple, defined by the conditions of the life he was leading. Then he had felt the importance of and had need of intercourse with nature, and with those who had lived and thought and felt before him, philosophers and poets. What he now considered necessary and important were human institutions and intercourse with his comrades. Then women seemed mysterious and charming, charming by the very mystery that enveloped them. Now the purpose of women, all women except those of his own family and the wives of his friends, was a very definite one. Women were the best means towards an already experienced enjoyment. Then money was not needed, and he did not require even 1/3 of what his mother allowed him. But now this allowance of 1,500 roubles a month did not suffice, and he had already had some unpleasant talks about it with his mother. Then he had looked on his spirit as the eye. Now it was his healthy, strong animal eye that he looked upon as himself. And all this terrible change had come about because he had ceased to believe himself, and had taken to believing others. This he had done because it was too difficult to live believing oneself. Believing oneself, one had to decide every question, not in favour of one's own animal life, which is always seeking for easy gratifications, but almost in every case against it. Believing others, there was nothing to decide. Everything had been decided already, and decided always in favour of the animal eye and against the spiritual. Nor was this all. Believing in his own self, he was always exposing himself to the censure of those around him. Believing others, he had their approval. So when Nekhludoff had talked of the serious matters of life, of God, truth, riches and poverty, all around him thought it out of place and even rather funny, and his mother and aunts called him, with kindly irony, notre cher philosophe. But when he read novels, told improper anecdotes, went to see funny vaudevilles in the French theatre, and gaily repeated the jokes, everybody admired and encouraged him. When he considered it right to limit his needs, wore an overcoat, took no wine, everybody thought it strange and looked upon it as a kind of showing off. But when he spent large sums on hunting, or on furnishing a peculiar and luxurious study for himself, everybody admired his taste and gave him expensive presents to encourage his hobby. While he kept pure, and meant to remain so till he married, his friends prayed for his health, and even his mother was not grieved, but rather pleased when she found out that he'd become a real man, and had gained over some Frenchwoman from his friend. As to the episode with Katusha, the princess could not without horror think that he might possibly have married her. In the same way, when Nekhludoff came of age, and gave the small estate he had inherited from his father to the peasants, because he considered the holding of private property in land wrong, this step filled his mother and relations with dismay, and served as an excuse for making fun of him to all his relatives. He was continually told that these peasants, after they had received the land, got no richer, but on the contrary poorer, having opened 3 public houses and left off doing any work. But when Nekhludoff entered the Guards and spent and gambled away so much with his aristocratic companions that Elena Ivanovna, his mother, had to draw on her capital, she was hardly pained, considering it quite natural and even good that wild oats should be sown at an early age and in good company, as her son was doing. At first Nekhludoff struggled, but all that he had considered good while he had faith in himself was considered bad by others, and what he had considered evil was looked upon as good by those among whom he lived, and the struggle grew too hard. And at last Nekhludoff gave in. That is, he left off believing himself and began believing others. At first, this giving up of faith in himself was unpleasant, but it did not long continue to be so. At that time he acquired the habit of smoking and drinking wine, and soon got over this unpleasant feeling and even felt great relief. Nekhludoff, with his passionate nature, gave himself thoroughly to the new way of life so approved of by all those around, and he entirely stifled the inner voice which demanded something different. This began after he moved to St. Petersburg, and reached its highest point when he entered the army. Military life, in general, depraves men. It places them in conditions of complete idleness, that is, absence of all useful work, frees them of their common human duties which it replaces by merely conventional ones, to the honour of the regiment, the uniform, the flag, and while giving them on the one hand absolute power over other men, also puts them into conditions of servile obedience to those of higher rank than themselves. But when, to the usual depraving influence of military service with its honours, uniforms, flags, its permitted violence and murder, there is added the depraving influence of riches, and nearness to and intercourse with members of the imperial family, as is the case in the chosen regiment of the Guards, in which all the officers are rich and of good family, then this depraving influence creates in the men who succumb to it a perfect mania of selfishness. And this mania of selfishness attacked Nekhludoff from the moment he entered the army and began living in the way his companions lived. He had no occupation whatever, except to dress in a uniform, splendidly made and well brushed by other people, and with arms also made and cleaned and handed to him by others, ride to reviews on a fine horse which had been bred, broken in, and fed by others. There, with other men like himself, he had to wave a sword, shoot off guns, and teach others to do the same. He had no other work, and the highly placed persons, young and old, the Tsar and those near him, not only sanctioned his occupation, but praised and thanked him for it. After this was done, it was thought important to eat, and particularly to drink, in officers' clubs or the salons of the best restaurants, squandering large sums of money, which came from some invisible source. Then theatres, ballets, women, then again riding on horseback, waving of swords and shooting, and again the squandering of money, the wine, cards, and women. This kind of life acts on military men even more depravingly than on others, because if any other than a military man leads such a life, he cannot help being ashamed of it in the depth of his heart. A military man is, on the contrary, proud of a life of this kind, especially at time of war, and Nekhludoff had entered the army just after war with the Turks had been declared. We are prepared to sacrifice ourselves at the wars, and therefore a gay, reckless life is not only pardonable, but absolutely necessary for us, and so we lead it. Such were Nekhludoff's confused thoughts at this period of his existence, and he felt all the time the delight of being free of the moral barriers he had formerly set himself, and the state he lived in was that of a chronic mania of selfishness. He was in this state when, after 3 years' absence, he came again to visit his aunts. End of Book 1, Chapter 13. Book 1, Chapter 14 of Resurrection. Nekhludoff went to visit his aunts, because their estate lay near the road he had to travel in order to join his regiment, which had gone forward, because they had very warmly asked him to come, and especially because he wanted to see Katusha. Perhaps in his heart he had already formed those evil designs against Katusha which his now uncontrolled animal self suggested to him, but he did not acknowledge this as his intention, but only wished to go back to the spot where he had been so happy, to see his rather funny but dear kind-hearted old aunts, who always, without his noticing it, surrounded him with an atmosphere of love and admiration, and to see sweet Katusha, of whom he had retained so pleasant a memory. He arrived at the end of March, on Good Friday, after the thaw had set in. It was pouring with rain, so that he had not a dry thread on him, and was feeling very cold, but yet vigorous and full of spirits, as always at that time. Is she still with them, he thought, as he drove into the familiar old-fashioned courtyard, surrounded by a low brick wall, and now filled with snow off the roofs. He expected she would come out when she heard the sledge bells, but she did not. Two barefooted women with pails and tucked-up skirts, who had evidently been scrubbing the floors, came out of the side door. She was not at the front door either, and only Tikhon, the manservant, with his apron on, evidently also busy cleaning, came out into the front porch. His aunt, Sophia Ivanovna, alone met him in the ante-room. She had a silk dress on and a cap on her head. Both aunts had been to church and had received communion. "Well, this is nice of you to come," said Sophia Ivanovna, kissing him. "Mary is not well, got tired in church. We've been to communion." "I congratulate you, Aunt Sophia." It is usual in Russia to congratulate those who've received communion. "I congratulate you, Aunt Sophia," said Nekhludoff, kissing Sophia Ivanovna's hand. "Oh, I beg your pardon, I've made you wet." "Go to your room." "Why, you're soaking wet. Dear me, you've got moustaches. Katusha, Katusha, get him some coffee. Be quick." Directly came the sound of a well-known, pleasant voice from the passage, and Nekhludoff's heart cried out, "She's here!" and it was as if the sun had come out from behind the clouds. Nekhludoff, followed by Tikhon, went gaily to his old room to change his things. He felt inclined to ask Tikhon about Katusha, how she was, what she was doing, and was she not going to be married? But Tikhon was so respectful, and at the same time so severe, insisted so firmly on pouring the water out of the jug for him, that Nekhludoff could not make up his mind to ask him about Katusha, but only inquired about Tikhon's grandsons, about the old so-called brother's horse, and about the dog Polkan. All were alive, except Polkan, who had gone mad the summer before. When he had taken off all his wet things and just begun to dress again, Nekhludoff heard quick, familiar footsteps and a knock at the door. Nekhludoff knew the steps and also the knock. No one but she walked and knocked like that. Having thrown his wet greatcoat over his shoulders, he opened the door. "Come in." It was she, Katusha, the same, only sweeter than before. The slightly squinting, naive black eyes looked up in the same old way. Now, as then, she had on a white apron. She brought him from his aunt's a piece of scented soap with the wrapper just taken off, and 2 towels, one a long Russian embroidered one, the other a bath towel. The unused soap with the stamped inscription, the towels, and her own self, all were equally clean, fresh, undefiled, and pleasant. The irrepressible smile of joy at the sight of him made the sweet, firm lips pucker up as of old. "How do you do, Dmitri Ivanovitch?" she uttered with difficulty, her face suffused with a rosy blush. "Good morning. "How do you do?" he said, also blushing. "Alive and well?" "Yes, the Lord be thanked. And here is your favourite pink soap and towels from your aunt's," she said, putting the soap on the table and hanging the towels over the back of a chair. "There is everything here," said Tikhon, defending the visitor's independence and pointing to Nekhludoff's open dressing-case, filled with brushes, perfume, fixatoire, a great many bottles with silver lids, and all sorts of toilet appliances. "Thank my aunts, please. Oh, how glad I am to be here," said Nekhludoff, his heart filling with light and tenderness as of old. She only smiled in answer to these words and went out. The aunts, who had always loved Nekhludoff, welcomed him this time more warmly than ever. Dmitri was going to the war, where he might be wounded or killed, and this touched the old aunts. Nekhludoff had arranged to stay only a day and night with his aunts, but when he had seen Katusha, he agreed to stay over Easter with them, and telegraphed to his friend Schönbock, whom he was to have joined in Odessa, that he should come and meet him at his aunt's instead. As soon as he had seen Katusha, Nekhludoff's old feelings toward her awoke again. Now, just as then, he could not see her white apron without getting excited. He could not listen to her steps, her voice, her laugh, without a feeling of joy. He could not look at her eyes, black as sloes, without a feeling of tenderness, especially when she smiled. And, above all, he could not notice without agitation how she blushed when they met. He felt he was in love, but not as before, when this love was a kind of mystery to him, and he would not own even to himself that he loved, and when he was persuaded that one could love only once. Now he knew he was in love, and was glad of it, and knew dimly what this love consisted of, and what it might lead to, though he sought to conceal it even from himself. In Nekhludoff, as in every man, there were two beings, one the spiritual, seeking only that kind of happiness for himself which should tend towards the happiness of all, the other the animal man, seeking only his own happiness, and ready to sacrifice to it the happiness of the rest of the world. At this period of his mania of self-love brought on by life in Petersburg and in the army, this animal man ruled supreme, and completely crushed the spiritual man in him. But when he saw Katusha, and experienced the same feelings as he had 3 years before, the spiritual man in him raised its head once more, and began to assert its rights. And up to Easter, during 2 whole days, an unconscious, ceaseless inner struggle went on in him. He knew in the depths of his soul that he ought to go away, that there was no real reason for staying on with his aunts, knew that no good could come of it, and yet it was so pleasant, so delightful, that he did not honestly acknowledge the facts to himself, and stayed on. On Easter Eve, the priest and the deacon who came to the house to say Mass had, so they said, the greatest difficulty in getting over the 3 miles that lay between the church and the old lady's house, coming across the puddles and the bare earth in a sledge. Nekhludoff attended the Mass with his aunts and the servants, and kept looking at Katusha, who was near the door and brought in the censers for the priests. Then, having given the priests and his aunts the Easter kiss, though it was not midnight and therefore not Easter yet, he was already going to bed when he heard the old servant Matrona Pavlovna preparing to go to the church to get the kulich and paski, Easter cakes, blessed after the midnight service. I shall go too, he thought. The road to the church was impassable, either on a sledge or on wheels, so Nekhludoff, who behaved in his aunt's house just as he did at home, ordered the old horse, the brother's horse, to be saddled, and instead of going to bed, he put on his gay uniform, a pair of tight-fitting riding breeches, and his overcoat, and got on the old, over-fed and heavy horse, which neighed continually all the way as he rode in the dark, through the puddles and snow, to the church. End of Book 1, Chapter 14.